First of all, I'm very happy to be here with you. It's Edwige Nuyens who asked me to do this presentation. And so I'm very grateful to her. I'm also grateful to Irinia and to Daria, who have helped me with the technical things of this presentation. So I'm Lісбет, and I'm a psychotherapist, and I've been working with people in different settings for about 30 years, working with individuals, with couples, and with groups. And I do this now from a private practice in Brussels, in Belgium, and I also work from home in Hoegaarden. I'm also a trainer in organizations. I've trained for profit and non-profit organizations. And I also train in postgraduate programs for coaches and for psychotherapists. I'm an integrative psychotherapist, and I am specialized in interpersonal neurobiology, which is an approach that was developed by Dan Siegel, and which is an approach that looks at what neuroscience can teach us about how we experience our internal world and how we connect with other people. And I'm also the mother of 2 adult children on the side. That happens as well. So hi, lovely to be with you today. I hope what I have to tell you today will be of use to you. Please let me know if you do have questions, ask them in the chat. And Daria has told me she would let me know if there's an urgent question. So if something is not clear, please let me know. So maybe a quick overview of what we'll be talking about today. We will look at mental health, and this webinar is about mental health and resilience in times of crisis. So we're going to start with looking at what is mental health, how can we understand resilience, and in order to make this a little bit more concrete, I will be using a concept which was developed by Dan Siegel, which is the window of tolerance. We will look a little bit at trauma, and then I hope we will have a lot of time to look at what are the things that you can do to, what are strategies that you can use to enhance your resilience in times of crisis. And before I start, I want to say that I'm sitting here with you feeling quite humble, because I realize that, of course, there's things that I know and that I can share with you, but there's also things that I really don't know. I don't have experience of war firsthand, and I've never had to leave my country in order to be safe, and I haven't lost people to war. The closest I've come to war is hearing the stories of both my parents who lived through the Second World War. So I don't know anything about that firsthand. However, I do know a couple of things that I want to share with you. And I know how trauma affects people. I know how trauma works on our system. And I understand how our nervous system works to protect us, but also what are the pitfalls of that. So I understand what needs to happen to support people that are going through trauma. And that's what I would like to share with you today. So if we're going to look at mental health, I think it's important that we start with a definition. What is mental health? When we say mental health, what do we mean? So mental health, we mean, is a state of well-being, so feeling well, which is characterized by a sense of resilience, harmony, and vitality. We will look closer to these words afterwards. Now, I think we can all understand this definition, but let's see if we can make this more concrete, what that means when we go into the concreteness of everyday life. And in order to do that, I like to draw on a few concepts which have been developed by Dan Siegel. This is Dan Siegel, which is my teacher, and he's a guy who developed the interpersonal neurobiology theory. And the first concept that I want to use of him is the triangle of well-being. This triangle of well-being is a kind of visual metaphor for three aspects that we all share in our experience of being human. So you see there's three parts here. The first is the embodied brain. The embodied brain, what does that mean? It means that all of us, we are born obviously in a body, and this body has a nervous system. The nervous system, which is in our body, and with a brain that is in our skull. So that's why we talk about an embodied brain, because the brain doesn't exist by itself in our skull. It is linked to our nervous system that goes all over our body. Yeah. A second aspect is relationships. What this means is that all of us as human beings, we are always in relationship with other people, in relationship with other living beings, in relationship with nature, with earth, with the social systems, a political system around us. So that's also another aspect which is really important in defining who we are as human beings. And the third aspect is our mind. And our mind is connected to our brain. It is not the same as our brain. It is more than our brain, but it is connected to everything that happens in our brain and in our embodied brain. And it's also connected to our relationship. The way our mind functions is linked to how we relate to the world around us. And so when we talk about mental health, obviously we are interested in our mind. How is our mind, and how is our mind working day to day? How well does our mind work? So what is mental health? Mental health, we said, is a sense of well-being. And when we are mentally well, when we are mentally healthy, what do we experience? Well, we experience calm arousal. So we are aroused because we are alert, we are present, but it's a calm kind of alertness, yes? And that means that when we are calmly aroused, we are able to respond to the challenges of everyday life. And we are able to respond as opposed to be reactive. So when we respond to daily life, it means we have a choice. We choose how we are going to respond. And we have a sense of agency, a sense of mastery. And so we respond to daily life with flexibility. We are able to adapt flexibly to what happens around us. Our reactions are also coherent. It makes sense what we do. We feel we have energy and we feel stable. So that's what it means to be mentally healthy. Also, we are engaged with the world around us. We are engaged socially with the people, with our environment, and we are receptive to what we perceive there. So that's a more concrete way of looking at mental well-being. So if this is mental well-being, mental health, then how can we understand what disrupts our mental well-being? How can we understand eventually mental illness? And this is important for us to understand in order to make sense of our experiences, particularly in times of high stress or eventually trauma. And maybe over the last months, you have felt that your mental well-being was disturbed. Maybe you feel irritated, you feel angry, you feel exhausted, you lose hope. But does that mean that your mental health is in danger? That's the question. And in order to understand better how this works in our mind, but how that's also linked to our brain works, and then how it affects our relationships, I want to start by explaining something about how our nervous system works. Now, don't panic. This is not going to be a lesson in neuroanatomy. I'm going to make it very simple and easy for you to understand. But this is really important to understand how it works in our brain and in our nervous system to understand our reactions. Our nervous system, there are grossly two parts in our nervous system. One part here on the right-hand side of your screen, that's the central nervous system. And the central nervous system consists of our brain, which is in our skull, and the spinal cord. Yeah, that's the central nervous system. And then there's the peripheral nervous system, which again has two parts, the autonomic and the somatic. The somatic peripheral nervous system, that's the part of our nervous system which is under our voluntary control. That is the sensory part and the motor part. We can decide whether we pay attention to what we smell, what we hear, what we taste. And definitely we can decide how we move. If I move my hand, it's because I make a decision. My hand normally is not just going to start moving by itself. So the somatic nervous system is voluntary. The other part of the peripheral nervous system is our autonomic nervous system. And this part of our nervous system is not under our voluntary control. So we do not decide that this works or not. It works automatically. Yeah? So this is the first part which is important to understand. Now, what is going to interest us today is this autonomic nervous system. Because this autonomic nervous system is, if you want, it's our personal surveillance system. It is like a guard which is always on duty and whose only task is to check, is something safe or is something dangerous? So that's all it has to do. And you don't have to think about that. It happens automatically. So that's the only task of our autonomous nervous system. It is continuously scanning internally in our body, scanning around us, other people, the environment, and the only thing it has to do is to decide, is it safe or is it dangerous? And this happens in a split second without involving the thinking part of our brain. So I don't have to think about this. It happens automatically below my awareness. So this is, you might have heard of it, it's the reptilian brain. And the goal of this autonomous nervous system is survival. Yeah. So it is directed to seeing, is it dangerous or is it safe? And with the goal is to keep us alive. So here you see what this autonomous nervous system does is it regulates arousal. So our heartbeat, our respiration, that is what the autonomous nervous system is going to regulate. I want to introduce a second concept, which is the concept of the window of tolerance. The window of tolerance is a band of arousal within which an individual can function well and is able to deal with everyday stress. So you see these two lines. Within these two lines, that's the window of tolerance. And within the two lines is the optimal arousal zone. So when our autonomous nervous system perceives that things are safe, my body's working well, my environment is safe, I'm okay, we are going to be within this optimal arousal zone. And we are able to respond, we are able to react with flexibility, adaptability, coherence, energy, and stability. Yeah. Now, this window of tolerance is different for everybody. It can be wider, this can be bigger, or it can be smaller. And that will depend on different things. It will depend, first of all, on some inborn factors, like, for example, your temperament. I think you can all recognize that some people have a more irritable or touchy temperament than others. So these people will have a smaller window of tolerance. It will be easier for these people to be disturbed. Other people are calmer and react always with more phlegm, and they have a bigger window of tolerance. So that's one thing that will determine how big this window is. Other things that will affect that are your relationships in your childhood. Were you securely attached to your parents, to your primary contacts, or was that a difficult relationship? That's also going to affect this, because this has to do with how you regulate your affect. Other things that are going to affect this is your age. I'm thinking, for example, like teenagers who are much more irritable. They'll have a smaller window of tolerance. Of course, if you live in a difficult situation socioeconomically, this will also affect this. What else do I want to tell you about this window? Yes, so you see this green line here. This line shows that on any moment, on any day, you are going to fluctuate in this window. You're going to have moments where you are more aroused, Maybe like me right now, you have to give a presentation, so you're a little bit nervous and you're a little bit higher. Yeah, there's more arousal than usually. At other times, your arousal will go down. You'll get tired at the end of the day. And so during the day, your level of arousal will fluctuate. Things will upset you, you will get angry, other things will make you sad, will make you feel a little bit down. But generally, you are able to stay within this optimal zone of arousal. You are able to use strategies to continue to function well. Yeah. What will also affect this is how tired you are, if you're hungry, maybe with certain people you get easily angry, with other people not. So there's a variation. So all this is within the window of tolerance, and this is what we would call normal functioning, regular sense of well-being and mental health. However, when we experience repeated or ongoing adversity, or when there's a sudden trauma, this can disrupt our nervous system and our senses are heightened. And then our reactions typically are going to be intensified and our strategies are less accessible to us. And repeated adverse reactions can push us outside the window of tolerance. So this capacity to keep the ebb and flow within the window will be less and you will push out. Yeah. So, and here you see what happens if the red arrow represents repeated stress or a big trauma. What happens is it affects our nervous system and we are going to go into a hyper arousal zone. This is the zone where people get into the fight and flight response, which is something that you might have heard about. So the hyper arousal zone is characterized by excessive activation. So this is a high energy zone. It is very charged. And this energy is going to go either into fight, so becoming angry, being very upset, or into flight, which is then being anxious and going into panic. So obviously, this is then going to affect our ability to relax. And it is going to affect our everyday functioning at a very basic level. So our sleep might be disturbed, our appetite might be disturbed, and it might be difficult for us to manage our emotions. There's a lot of energy. And also it is going to be more difficult to think clearly because all our energy goes into fighting what we perceive as danger or running away from it. What is also going to happen in this zone is that because we perceive the world as a dangerous place or the other as a dangerous person, we feel unsafe, and we experience everything as a threat. And of course, this leads to a perception of the world which starts from a place of me versus you. I am ready either to fight or to run away. So that's the hyperarousal zone. Now, what happens is after a while, if this stops, we might go back into the window. But if this continues too long, and if it's too much overwhelm, too much pain, more than our brain is able to tolerate, we might plunge into a state of hypoarousal. So this is what you see here. So you see, not the stress is ongoing or the trauma is really big, and then you might plunge into hypoarousal. Hypoarousal is the state of collapse. So this is the state where you shut down. So we're here in hyperarousal, there's a lot of energy. In hypoarousal, there's no energy left. Everything falls flat. So you shut down. Eventually, you even dissociate. And what you experience there is complete exhaustion, eventually depression, or, no feeling at all, kind of feeling numb. And of course, this state is also going to affect your basic physiological functioning. So here you might want to sleep all the time. Maybe you don't want to eat at all, and your digestion is slowed down. And definitely you feel emotionally either numb or very depressed. Also, it affects the way that you are able to think, because there's so little energy, you can't think clearly. So we identify these three states: the optimal arousal, where you feel well, hyperarousal, and hypoarousal. Again, these states happen to you automatically. So your nervous system is going to either keep you in the optimal arousal, bring you in hyper, or push you into hypo. And I think you can compare it with an animal that's in danger. An animal in danger is going to decide, can I fight? Can I flight? Or shall I play dead? Yeah. But each of these states is always in the function of survival. Yeah? It's how our brain takes over for us in order for our whole system to survive. So what we've seen so far with this window of tolerance is that stress, ongoing stress or trauma, can disrupt our nervous system and may, and I emphasize, may lead to mental health issues. Not necessarily, but it may lead to mental health issues. So quickly, maybe some definitions about trauma. A definition that I like is trauma can be anything that happens which is too much, too fast, too soon, or too long, coupled with not enough of what should have happened that was resourcing. So what you take out of that is trauma is, first of all, something that happens to you. You don't make it happen to you. It happens to you. And either you can't escape, or your experience is that you can't escape. And third, there's no support or not enough support. So these three things make that something might be traumatic. And again, trauma is not necessarily what happens to you, but it's what happens inside you as a result of what happened. So something happens, there's an event, a stress or a war, and it becomes traumatic. Indeed, if the trauma scars you and makes you less flexible, more rigid, less feeling, and more defended. So this is important because for me, this is a definition in which there's hope. So it's not because trauma happens that you are helpless. It affects you, that's clear. It affects you in your nervous system, but we are not helpless. So far we've talked about mental health and what mental health means. It's well-being that we recognize through resilience, harmony, and vitality. We've looked at this window of tolerance, which helps us to understand how our nervous system works for us. We don't have to do anything, it happens automatically. Now, what I would like to look at is, okay, so if that's mental health, and we see how mental health can be disrupted, what are then warning signs of mental health problems? The first warning sign is when you are stuck on. What I mean with that is when you are in continuous, ongoing hyperarousal. So when you are continuously outside your window of tolerance on the top side. So this is characterized by this hypervigilance that never turns off. You are continuously alert, or you are continuously and ongoing in a panic, or you are continuously not just angry, but enraged, and you have rage outbursts, or you show self-destructive behavior. Another sign of this hyperarousal might be ongoing, recurrent, and involuntary distressing memories. So memories that come all the time and that are very upsetting, or also nightmares. So this is a sign of being stuck in this hyperarousal. That's a first warning sign. Another warning sign is to be stuck on off. So what Daria was saying, the first days she was sleeping all the time. Well, if this continues and if this is ongoing, then you're stuck on off. And this is characterized by states of dissociation. Dissociation is when you're not really there and you can't access memories, you can't feel your emotions, or you can't feel your body, or you have moments where you lose track of time. We all have that in little ways from time to time, but when really you realize that 2 hours passed and you have no idea of what happened. Other signals of being stuck on off is what we call depersonalization. Depersonalization is when you feel yourself as being a robot, that you're not in control of your speech or your movements, or when you feel completely cut off from the world around you. Deep depression can also be a sign of stuck in hypoarousal. Another signal of mental health problems is when somebody is really unable to engage socially. So it's normal to have moments of withdrawal and isolation, but when you always isolate yourself, when you're always completely withdrawn, when there is a serious disruption in your intimate relationships, when you end up mistrusting everybody all the time, that's a warning sign. So you can see how these signals would seriously interfere both with your sleep, with your eating habits, with your working, and with your functioning in everyday life. So what is really important is if you notice some of these symptoms in yourself, or if someone you know, please reach for help, because this is not hopeless. Trauma-informed psychotherapy is very efficient. So what is important is that you find a therapist who is trauma-informed, who is specifically trained to work with trauma, but these people can really help you to overcome being stuck and going back into your window of tolerance. So we've talked about mental health, we've talked about what can go wrong there. I think it's really important to look at resources also, and it's really important to maintain hope. So I've tried to gather some strategies to nurture your resilience and your well-being, and I had developed these particularly for people who are not in Ukraine, because I thought that the majority of you were going to be people who left Ukraine and who are all over Europe. But what I see is that there's lots of people in Kiev there. So apologies if this doesn't really match. I will try to adapt as possible. For these strategies, I want to thank Eric de Soir, who's a colleague of mine and who's a trauma psychotherapist. And he developed a folder discussing the tragedy of war, a guide for families hosting refugees from the war in Ukraine. And this was an inspiration for me to develop these strategies that we will discuss. So I have listed 7 strategies, and I will try to focus on those that are applicable for those of you who are still in Ukraine, as well as for those who are all over Europe. The first strategy is about learning to work with your nervous system. So I hope it makes sense to you how the nervous system works. And what I want to propose is that you can learn to work with your nervous system. So it is absolutely normal when you are confronted with a traumatic event, such as the sudden start of a war, that you feel disrupted and that you go into hyper arousal or in hypo arousal. And definitely the state of hyper arousal is needed to be able to survive and also to escape from a dangerous situation. And it is also absolutely normal that this hyper aroused state goes on for a while. So it's absolutely normal to continue for a while to feel hyper alert, to have this heightened sense of activation, to have difficulty sleeping, to have nightmares, to be more irritable, and to feeling restless. It's normal because when you are in this situation, you need to be hyper aroused. So what is important in this is to continue to follow your own rhythm. Probably you will first want to be physically safe. You want to attend to safety for yourself, for your children, for your family. And it's only then that when you feel that you can be safe, that slowly, when you have fled your country, you can get used to your new environment. And only then can you start to think about some kind of perspective. And finally, afterwards comes the expression of emotion, grief, and remembering. I have a little note about children here. Children may also feel or appear numb at first. And it might very well be that first it feels like nothing happens for them. And it's often only later that difficulties appear or that they will express that they find things difficult. And for children, what is very important is that they are allowed to just be kids, to continue to just be kids. And that means being able to play and being able to receive education. I want to invite you at this point to to enter into a little exercise. It's a very simple exercise, but which is very useful to start to track your affect and then to see if you can shift it. But the first step is to notice. So this exercise is called Notice and Name, and it was developed by a lady called Deb Dana. And I want to invite you to go into it at this very moment. So if you want to turn off your camera, you want. It's only going to take a few moments, and I'm not going to ask you to share anything about this. But I want you to take a moment to check in with yourself. And you might want to close your eyes if that feels better, but in any ways, just focus on you in your body at this moment. And notice, how are you? How are you right now? And if you think about the window of tolerance, with being within the window in the center and then being in hyper or in hypo, where are you right now? Where would you put yourself in this window of tolerance? Turn toward your experience and bring curiosity and compassion to your experience. And just notice, what are your bodily sensations? How is your breathing at the moment? Are you breathing shallow? Are they small, rapid breaths? Or do you take deep and full breaths? Can you feel your heart beating? Does it beat calmly or quickly? Do you notice in your body that some areas in your body are tense and others that are relaxed? And then look at your emotions. What are you feeling at this moment? Are you feeling alert? Are you feeling calm? Are you feeling excited, happy, sad, tired? And then what are the thoughts that you have? And how are you acting? What are you doing? Are you sitting still? Are you wiggling on your chair? And then listen for a moment to the story of the state you find yourself in. What is the story that you tell at this moment about yourself, about who you are, about the relationships you have with people, about the world around you? So this exercise of notice and name is a first step. It's a first step to learn to notice and to bring into awareness something that happens automatically. Our nervous system is automatically going to keep us within the window of tolerance in hyperarousal or in hypoarousal. And an interesting exercise is to stop and to notice, where am I? So I'll give you another exercise, which we're not going to do now, but which I really invite you to do for yourself, because it's a very interesting one. What I would invite you to do is that for each state, so within the window, hyper and hypo, try to reflect on, what are my bodily sensations? What are my bodily sensations when I am within the window? Oh, I feel fine. But what is that fine? How do I feel that I am relaxed and well? How do I feel when I am hyper? And also, then what emotions am I experiencing? What are my feelings when I am hyper? Am I angry? Am I sad? And what thoughts do I have? What do I think about myself, about others, about the world? That's very different when I am within my window, when I'm hyper or when I'm hypo. When I'm within my window, I tend to think most people are good people. I tend to think that the world is a good place. When I'm hyper, me personally, I have a tendency of being more angry. I don't get scared so quick. I get more angry. Yeah. And when I'm hypo, I tend to feel really sorry for myself. I think, oh, poor me. Yeah. So these are the thoughts. And then how do I act? So ask yourself these questions for each state. And then afterwards, ask yourself the question and reflect on, how did I get there? What triggered me? What triggered me to go into hyper? What triggered me to fall into hypo? That's really interesting to notice because that's also different for each of us. And then the last thing I would like you to reflect on is, what can I do? What can I do either to support myself to stay within the window, or what can I do to move me out of hyper back into the window, or out of hippo back in the window? This is a very useful exercise, again, to bring the unconscious processes into awareness and to take back agency. This is how you work with your nervous system. Okay, so that was the first strategy. This is then specifically for the people who are in a guest country. So it's very important to get to know your guest country, and that takes time. Take that time, make allowance for it. And make sure to also get to know the fun and the nice things of your guest country. Of course, it's difficult. You have to adapt to a different language. There's a culture shock. Things might be very different from your home country. But make sure to also get to know the fun and the nice things of your guest country. The next strategy that I thought of is talking about the war. And here, I think all I want to say is, again, this was more specifically for people who left the country, is to be careful about how you talk about the war around children, because children are very sensitive, and when they overhear adult conversation, they might give their own interpretations to what they hear. So it's important to take that into consideration. The next strategy I wanted to talk about is focusing on resilience. If you have left your country, this took a lot of courage, this took grit, this took creativity, and that makes you a successful survivor. But staying in your country also takes courage, creativity, and grit. So I think faced with the danger of war, you have to show resilience every day. And if we look at the definition of resilience, it is a capacity to adapt to change, to overcome setbacks, and to use difficulties as an opportunity to grow as a person. So resilience is the quality of being able to adapt to stressors. And I think as people, we are often much more resilient than we thought we were. There's been research about this, and this shows that confronted with hardship, about 70% of the people is able to bounce back. Not immediately, but they're able to bounce back and are able to lead a meaningful and happy life again. Now, what is interesting is to look at these people that bounce back. How do they show resilience? First of all, they show mental flexibility. Mental flexibility means that you are curious, that you are able to adapt and to think creatively, and that you work to understand how your system works, to understand how you work. That you accept what you cannot change. There's things that you cannot change. However, there are things, sometimes very small, but that you can change, on which you can have an effect. So focus on what is important here and now. And don't do this alone, but do it in connection with others. Resilient people are people who notice available resources and who use them whenever possible. And they're also able to move one step at a time. So you're doing this already. Another thing that you can do is to dig into past strengths. So you might remember a time before the war when you got through other minor forms of adversity in your life. And then look at how did you deal with that? Maybe you lost somebody, maybe you had a nasty teacher in school. Well, how did you deal with that? What are the resources that you used? And looking at that, look at, okay, what are my strengths? What can I fall back on? What are the coping mechanisms that I'm good at using? And then contact these forms of resilience and strengthen them. Then we come to a fifth source of resilience. It's being aware that contradicting emotions are absolutely normal. It is absolutely normal to at times feel anger and indignation directed at the people who caused the conflict. Maybe you also feel anger and indignation at the lack of military involvement of Europe and US. And at other times you may feel upheaval, despair, emotional collapse. One moment you might engage in discussions, and the next you may collapse and lose all hope. So it's important to realize that this is completely normal and understandable. You're not going to be even keel and just cruise through this. It's also really important to continue to take time for relaxation and for humor. Self-care, really important. It's important from time to time to turn off the news about the war and to focus on fun and nice things with friends and family. We all need relaxation at time, and you need to continue to take care of yourself, eating at regular times, exercise, just basic self-care is important. Finally, it is really important to keep contact as much as possible with family and friends, whether you are at home or whether you are in a different country. And I think what we are doing here, this joining efforts and sharing experiences, is of the utmost importance. So this fosters a sense of community. This is a focus on solidarity and on creativity, which is really important that we continue to feel this sense of connection within the country, with people outside of the country. And so I hope that what we've done today can help for that. I have added a list of resources. I'm not going to go through them now because I'm just really aware of the time. You will get them. And I want to see if there's some questions. With the resources, the only thing I will say is it's really important to check with yourself. I've given some suggestions. They are my suggestions, but the most important thing when you look at these resources is to see, does it make sense to me? And then if you try it out, does it work for me? If it works, great. If it doesn't work, please throw it out and do something different. And I really hope it's useful to you.